Hello, everybody. Welcome to Underneath. This is Kale Zeldin, and I wanted to talk to you today about an article that I came across a few days back, but I don't want to time this recording to a specific time. But it's from one of my favorite writers, Mary Harrington, and I'm a real big fan of Mary's. I read pretty much everything she puts out. I came across her a couple of years back when she had started her Substack. I believe it was called Reactionary Feminism, and anyway, she's just a brilliant thinker. She comes at things. Her own sort of personal story is part of what makes her intriguing to me as someone who has kind of like read her way back from sort of the Church of Progress. And initially, this led her to question whether she believed in progress at all, and therefore had a kind of atypical response to feminism, um, still calling herself a feminist, but a kind of reactionary feminist. And if you sort of look at that framing, a reactionary is someone who sort of takes a kind of convention and sort of sees problems in that. At any rate, what she's talking about in this article, it's on Unherd, and of course the description is down in the show notes, and I will show you that is a piece about Gen X and Gen Y and Gen Z and millennials and sort of this uh, generational theory. I've actually been doing a little bit of a dive into thinking more deeply about the formations of the generations, and I think that Mary has been helpful to me in this regard, though one of my watchers and listeners and followers suggested that I finally do the deep dive into the fourth turning, and so I'm in the middle of that. So that's partly being inflected here. But the age of nihilism is over, she claims. Gen Z wants to fill the void. So let's go on over here. All right. So she starts off, and I'm just going to work my way through the article and I'm sort of riff on my comments. I've pre-marked up my web uh, my web version of this article, trying something a little bit new here, just so that I can follow along with my own thinking. So if you see these green marks in the margins, know that that's what I am doing. So philosophy, claimed Etienne Gilson, always buries its undertakers. Now I got to tell you, as a Roman Catholic, I'm super excited to see that Mary is invoking this great 20th century French Thomist philosopher. He's really fantastic, and I just love the fact that she is invoking him here. And of course, the quip here, that philosophy buries its undertakers. In other words, there's a kind of enduring quality here in philosophy that those that bury the philosophers, or philosophy, I should say, oftentimes um, have a way of not getting the job done. At any rate, philosophy, claimed Etienne Gilson, always buries its undertakers. Gilson was himself a philosopher, so perhaps he had an interest in believing this, but there might be something in it as the complaints pile up about cultural stagnation and loss of meaning. And so you can see that Mary is very much sort of dropping this right in the middle of the meaning crisis discussion. Right? Britain's young people are on a renewed quest for higher things. And I think you can extrapolate this out. I don't think it is just Britain. One of the forms this seems to be taking, at least for some, is a turn toward God. According to a new study, quiet revival is afoot in British Christianity, and this is just a stunning figure. The proportion of 18 to 24-year-olds who attend church at least monthly has risen from 4% just prior to COVID to 16% in 2024. So again, a start from 4 to 16%. And she says, of course, this is startling. And yet it may also be true that England's Christian heritage is as moribund as ever, at least in the institutional sense. And so she'll go on to say that a lot of this church attendance is not happening in the established Church of England, but rather in these other churches. In terms of England, this is kind of a big deal, but that Catholicism and Pentecostal churches, charismatic churches, are proving to be the places where you see this startling increase points, of course, to the moribund quality of the C of E, the Church of England. And, nothing is more established. I mean that almost definitionally. It is the established church of the state of England, and any sort of American pretense toward a separation of church and state simply does not register. And if you know anything about the history of the English Reformation, you know that those that recuse themselves from the official church, or those that were dissenters, either in their Protestant variations or Roman Catholicism, were very much on the outside of things. And what is the purpose of a church state? Well, in part, the purpose of the church state is that it provides the sort of the meaning mechanism for which a people can worship, and through which a people mint themselves as a people, as the English. And so in England, the idea of the moribund nature of their national church is more important, I think, than you might certainly than it is relative to the United States of America. The United States of America has always been at least some versions of pluralist, although as a recent podcast I listened to noted, that was largely a pluralism that was Protestant first and kind of loosely Trinitarian friendly. So anyway, my point here is that in England, this loss of English church attendance, I think, is potentially much more catastrophic, because it is the church, of course, that creates England, right? It is the Christianity that creates England as an identity. And so, what happens when your primary institutional formators have lost their metaphysics? This isn't the first indicator that some kind of religious backswing is underway among the young. A poll in January, for example, revealed that Gen Zs are half as likely as their parents to identify as atheists. Now, so this is really interesting, because as the narrative has been given to us, that atheism is a kind of natural subtraction, a kind of natural ending point once modernity's acid finally melts away these vestiges of old stories. I think it's Daniel Dennett that talked about evolution, the story of evolution, as being the kind of universal solvent. And it appears that that universal solvent isn't quite as universal as it might have pretended to. Now, notice it has certainly um, um, corroded the established church, but these other churches are not. Gen Zs are half as likely as their parents to identify as atheists. The trend reaches beyond England. She goes on to talk about the French and in other places, and mentions, of course, friend of the podcast, Rod Dreher. Shout out, Rod. How you doing? So that Rod Dreher documented a similar pattern of Christian revival across the West, especially among young people, settling this in the wider context of a general youthful turn toward spirituality. Dreher argues that the governing feature of those churches that are thriving is their orientation toward the numinous, whether expressed through adherence to ancient high church's liturgy or through intense charismatic spiritual communion. In other words, Rod is pointing to the weird and strange churches seeing a kind of upswing, a church that very much grounds its identity in either a non-modernist frame or a pre-modernist frame. And of course, it depends upon who you ask and how you ask the question. But the idea of the numinous, the spiritual, the metaphysical, is crucial and key. And so then I think Mary asks the right question. Well, what exactly is it about these weird churches, either old, super old-fashioned smells and bells liturgies, or intense charismatic experiences? Why is it that young people are gravitating toward that, and not the sort of the comfortable, cozy church with the nice, comfortable, cozy vicar at the bottom of the street? And I think it's because the fusing of an institution who is at least theoretically metaphysical has given up its claims to those things which make it more than just a kind of NGO or you know, I don't know, some sort of charity organization, right? Uh, Nor is it any different than what they get at school or what they get through the NHS or what they get through the various organs of sense making, meaning making, these institutions that prop up a people. And so it's no wonder that the enervation of the English, at least as I'm hearing and reading about it, I'm not an expert, but you can see it. And of course, the enervation of the mainstream here in my own country, and I would imagine elsewhere, partly that enervation. And look, and let's be very clear, the enervation in my own Roman Catholic Church, in the sense that, if the church presents merely a kind of flattened bourgeois do-gooderism, what good is it for? I myself, when I was 16 or 17 years old, put two and two together in terms of the version of the church that was um, sold to me in high school, was fine but flat. In other words, it had a good heart. It wanted to help the poor and it wanted to focus on service. Those are real and true things, but they did so at the disemphasis upon both the personal um, call to holiness, but also on any kind of sense toward the metaphysical or the sort of the divine telos that the church had traditionally modeled for all those years. And so I think England is in a special place. Now, she goes on to say here, but why would this be happening at all? Why especially young people? And why the mystical edge? I wonder if this trend is less about a spiritual awakening among Gen Z and more about how sharply this contrasts with the generation that raised them, the so called Gen X, born roughly 1965 to 80. And of course, I am a Gen Xer. I was born in 1973. And I think Mary finds herself on the very tail end of the Gen X, and she might be an early millennial. And she makes this quick. I like this. She says, "I belong," she says, "just about to this demographic. It's an open question for me whether Gen X exists at all, or it just comprises those boomers born too late to enjoy the fun phase of smashing history, heritage, and the future." I get what she's saying, and I do sort of wonder if, when all is said and done, the Gen Xers will finally get the erasure we've all sensed all along. But her point is that, and I distinctly remember, growing up in the aftermath of the post 60s euphoria, right when I sort of came into consciousness, roughly 1981 2 3, when you're just coming of age and sort of starting to see things. I remember the kind of, like, you could sense the kind of nostalgia that I had missed something. And I remember when MTV first put through, gosh, this must have been, I don't know, like that. This is 79 would have been 10 years. So in 84, it would have been the 15-year reunion. So they were just sort of starting these kind of reunions and marking that it had gone. And I just remember being like, I'm not sure what all this stuff is about. At any rate, either way, by the time, this is Mary, by the time I reached adolescence in the early 90s, there didn't seem much left to believe in. And yet, growing up in an unusually peaceful and prosperous era, we combine this sense of post-cultural enemy with far too much time to think. And that captures that sense, Now, and for me, of course, I feel like I did a kind of speed run through the anime she talks about, right? Um, eh, because I read my way back into the faith uh, toward the end of my freshman year in college. And in part, it's because I read some really great things in college, some old stuff that I couldn't quite account for, that it was. Anyway, I don't want to get into that. But anyway, I sort of read my way back into the church. And so I watched a lot of what Mary's talking about with a kind of double consciousness. I'm part of Gen X, but I had already kind of gone through Gen X nihilism and sort of returned as a very young Catholic in the midst of the nihilism that I saw all around me. So even when I listened to the music of my generation, much of which I liked, and I watched the movies of my generation, much of which I liked, I always had a kind of double consciousness there. and I saw that the reaction, the artistic nihilism that I saw was a reaction to a kind of already flattened a metaphysical realm, right? So she goes on to say the result was a pervasive sense of nihilism as a kind of moral duty, and that really does capture something about Gen X, right? That in order to be responsible, you had to be a nihilist. I remember I was watching, this must have been in the summer of 92. The Red Hot Chili Peppers had put out an album called Blood Sugar Sex Magic, and it's one of their best albums. I'm not really a Chili Peppers fan, but I thought that album was really good. And in part, you find out that the album was really good because it was written by this guitarist by the name of John Frusciante or something like that. And he I don't know if he's alive or dead, but he went in and out of the band because he really struggled with a heroin addiction. But he was in many respects, the sort of the musical brains of that album. And I was watching a documentary one time of the filming of that, and you could see that he was a mess, but a genius nonetheless. And he makes this sort of offhand comment, like, "Yeah, who can kind of believe in anything after the Holocaust?" And it always sort of struck me like that's odd to me. The Holocaust was an expression of nihilism. Why would I react to the Holocaust with a kind of nihilistic gloss? But at any rate, that was very much in the air. This sort of this, you have a moral duty to be a nihilist. Um, uh, and a profound, unshakable truth. It's difficult to convey these virulently ideological times, but back in the 90s, Nirvana's anthem to existential boredom uh, felt fiercely real in its raw but morally empty energy. Here we are now, entertain us. The same restless, angry alienation energizes the work of writer Irvin Welsh in his novel Train Spotting, and of course, the famous film. And that's where I saw it, and the opening monologue of this film. And I'd like to share it real quick because I want to just show you. It's the first opening minute and a half of the clip. I think it's worth hearing and seeing, very much so. I think it's very much worth hearing. So let me share my screen. I'll get to the YouTube. We'll share that. And let me mute my mic, and then we will get.
Choose life, choose a job, choose a career, choose a family, choose a fucking big television, choose washing machines, cars, compact displays and electrical tin openers. Choose good health, low cholesterol and dental insurance. Choose fixed interest mortgage repayments. Choose a starter home. Choose your friends. Choose leisure wear and matching luggage. Choose a three-piece suite on hire purchase and a range of fucking fabrics. Choose DIY and wondering who the fuck you are on a Sunday morning. Choose sitting on that couch watching mind-numbing, spirit-crushing game shows, stuffing fucking junk food into your mouth. Choose rotting away at the end of it all, pissing your last in a miserable home, nothing more than an embarrassment to the selfish, fucked up brats that you've spawned to replace yourselves. Choose your future. Choose life. Here comes Johnny. But why would I want to do a thing like that? I chose not to choose life. I chose something else. And the reasons? There are no reasons. Who needs reasons when you've got heroin?
Sorry. So you can kind of see that spirit that Ewan McGregor captures so well in The Young Renton. And the movie is a very disturbing film. But I remember at the time I saw that, I had already sort of reverted back to the faith, and I was sort of knee deep in Aristotle and Shakespeare and Dante and Dostoevsky by that point. But I'm watching this critique of the sort of the moment with real fascination, because it rang true to what it rang true to how do I say it? It rang true to the kind of critique that I thought was salient. Like, I thought that what he was seeing as the sort of the flat, nothing core of the world that I was stepping into then as a young adult, he chooses heroin and I chose Jesus, I guess, um, was a fair point to be made, and I would have been right there with his critique. And it reminds me of the same kind of nihilistic critique that the movie Fight Club offers, the sort of the consumerist hellscape that movie focuses on. And, again, it's hard to explain just how good of a critique it was. But, for me then, of course, it wasn't enough. I needed something toward which to shoot that was beyond the sort of the imminent frame, I guess we might say. Yeah, but let's go back to Mary here. So she continues. For the heroin addicted anti-hero Renton, played by Ewan McGregor there, life is empty of meaning and purpose. It's mere mechanical, dull consumer's tedium, grinding toward a loveless, pointless, neglected end. Choose rotting away at the end of it all, as you say. So, and you know, uh, Mary is writing about this from the perspective of being a Brit in that era. I'm talking about it as a perspective of being an American in this era, and I think that there was cross pond resonance there. I think that that was very much true. Um, and it was enthrallingly, as she points, enthrallingly self-destructive was Renton, just as, of course, Kurt Cobain was in the other ones. Now, but what happens, she says, then when nihilists have kids? What a great line. What happens when nihilists have kids? That's just fantastic, right? Because if you are sincere in your nihilism, it would seem to be the height of hypocrisy to even have kids. And so one of the reasons why I speed ran my way through, agnosticism and then atheism and a kind of whatever nihilism and kind of back to meaning was that I simply recognized that there was no point in anything absent a kind of metaphysic. And Mary too, right? I think that's what she's talking about here. So, uh, what happens when nihilists have kids? Raising kids requires innumerable choices, all of which tacitly concede a vision of the good. Right? And she's right. When you have kids, you recognize that you cannot simply pretend that every choice you make is a kind of radical A B test oriented toward your ultimate vision of the good. But what if you are ideologically unaligned with any kind of good? What if you don't believe in your good? Describing his own predicament as a Gen X parent, the novelist Euan Morrison, a friend and contemporary of Irvin Welsh, the writer of Trainspotting, a friend captured this paradox. Sorry, captured this paradox in a recent talk when he recalled seeing a young woman in the '90s wearing a T-shirt emblazoned with the Sex Pistols' "No" slogan "No future" over a visibly pregnant belly. And so you have this. You have the kind of the biological layer and the meme layer, right? The sort of the cultural layer and the subcultural layer, and there's an absolute disconnect between the two of those things. You're wearing a T-shirt that says "Nothing matters." No future, and your body is telling you, well, actually, there is technically a future. You're gestating a future right now, and so maybe your biology knows something that your head doesn't. What does it mean to disavow futurity even as you're gestating it? And how do you go about raising the resulting kids? The object of philosophy and religion has classically been eudaimonia, human flourishing. I love that she uses the right word there, because oftentimes that gets sort of translated as happiness, and happiness just has a sort of a happy, clappy, just very not deep, superficial quality to it. But eudaimonia, this idea of flourishing, does have more salience. I think if we can kind of get accustomed to talking in terms of eudaimonia or human flourishing, it's better. I know Peterson often talked, and I think correctly, about the goal of life is not happiness. I think I would say right, nor is it suffering, as he seemed to intimate, but rather, can we find human flourishing through all of that, through the suffering? But by the end of the 20th century, she goes on, Pache Etienne Gilson, even those adults who chose not just life but creating new life, often struggled to articulate what a flourishing should look like. In Train Spotting, the only parents are the addicts Leslie and Sick Boy, whose neglected baby dies gruesomely, it should be added, while they're in the midst of a heroin high. But the fact that Gen Z has reached adulthood at all suggests that even parents with a fondness for Nietzsche and goth music generally didn't prove as radically relativist as Leslie and Sick Boy when it came to pursuing eudaimonia for their own children, right? So just like the very fact that you would couple and have children belies the meme layer that you allegedly ascribe to. Now, I'm always fascinated by the way that this dynamic works, right? There's the sort of the stuff that you say out loud, and then there's the stuff that you do. And if there's not some kind of resonance or harmony between those two things, then something is at odds. And it's like, what is that old experiment? Like, if an alien came down and followed me around for a week, would he convict me of being a Christian? What would the alien say I cared most about? There's an interesting thought experiment, but you can kind of do the same thing to a self-professed nihilist. If an alien came and followed you around for a week, would the alien accuse you or claim that, oh yeah, that person, they're a nihilist, nothing means anything, nothing matters? Probably not. All right, very simply, very simply, much of the circle was squared by pragmatist parents who embraced a vague humanism or new atheism while teaching their kids to say please and thank you, and answering questions about Christmas and Easter with a shrug. Right? These things, these sort of cultural artifacts, because if you are an atheist, if you are a nihilist, these things are vestiges of an unmelted away ancient sickness, essentially, right? The idea of a mind virus, a kind of meme layer virus that, why would you participate or partake in them? And, you can sort of see that, you know, uh, you can unleash that acid, at least theoretically, on all of these things, yet how you conduct yourself, how you have children and raise children and celebrate birthdays and celebrate holidays, it begs questions. It's like, well, what gives? What is this whole Christmas thing? And by the way, why be nice? Why be kind? And yet, at a deeper level, the ambivalence remains between the need to model the good for your kids and the relativists' aversion to any such definitive moral stance. In turn, this produced a distinctive approach to child rearing that the philosopher Agnes Collard characterizes as acceptance parenting. Acceptance parents, Kayod argues, disavow any obligation to provide a substantive account of the good for their kids. Instead, children are left to determine what happiness means for themselves. And I have actually met these kinds of people. In fact, I remember working with a guy back in the day. He was a Catholic guy, and he and his wife, they were kind of a little bit on the hippie side of the spectrum. And they determined that instead of raising their kids in the faith, that they were going to let their kids choose their own adventure. And of course, this made no sense to me then. I was a young and fairly I don't know, maybe intolerant fellow. But I very sort of quickly deduced, well, all you're doing is modeling to your daughters that what you think is the most important thing is not really the most important thing. Because if you thought it was the most important thing, then you would make darn sure that they would be raised in it and be formed by it. But since you don't, do you really believe it in the first place? And I really do believe this. Now, this Agnes Collard is a fascinating person because she is sort of one of these sort of experiments in living. She rather famously decided to leave her fellow philosopher husband at the University of Chicago and to date one of her graduate students, or maybe someone who's just out of graduate school. And now they all live together, and it's all very strange. But I mean, I just personally find this kind of thing totally reprehensible. And I think that, you know, if you were going to sort of throat clear about other philosophers, like, I don't know, in the past that have had problematic relationships with people, etc., like, I think you should raise the same question here with Collard. Collard, I'm sorry, I'm very bad at names. Collard. And the fact that she, as a philosopher, now remember, the philosopher is supposed to be someone who is deeply attuned to the art and science of living and dying. And she is going to raise her kids in the nothingness, the sort of the soup of nothingness, and kind of will let them choose their own adventure. And there's a real malign spirit in all of that. Like, I can't imagine believing that certain things are good, things that I have learned sometimes by actually touching, the hot oven. Tradition and wisdom is that kind of knowledge pulled through the heart, knowledge through experience that, is so important to the human condition and to the human family. And this kind of radical aloneism, this kind of radical isolationism, this acceptance parenting that you should just sort of shrug your shoulders when a child naturally asks those most important questions. And of course, the most important questions are, who am I? Is there a God? Where did I come from? What am I supposed to do with this, 80-ish or so years that I'll live here on this planet, likely, given that most of us live in the first world, and, obviously, all the caveats aside, but, what am I supposed to do with this? What's the story? And to leave kids to their own devices in that regard is a kind of strange neo-barbarism that makes no sense. Nihilism makes no sense. And to give that, I mean, that's what you're giving. Like, it's not that you're just deciding not to give anything to your kids. It's like you're giving your kids nothing, like nothing as a kind of a force that they're going to have to kind of contend with. And I just find it reprehensible. As the children of Gen X reach adulthood, we can thus ask, what kind of adults does such an upbringing produce? In What Are Children For?, published last year, Anastasia Berg and Rachel Weissman offer some indication of how it feels to grow up under acceptance parenting. And I really love this, right? The idea of ask a kid, ask an adult child of acceptance parenting. Wiseman recounts quizzing her own mother about whether there was anything at all she could choose to do that would disappoint her mother. The kind of things that you want to know as a kid. Her mother demurred. Wiseman found this less supportive than incomprehensible. Her purported indifference was sweet, but also baffling. And I would suggest, and I think Mary is intimating here, is that there's nothing sweet about this. This is malign. This is mean. Like, in the sort of the most, it's low. And uh, I would argue is, at least on the meme layer, abusive. It's not difficult to see how a generation that's saying, oh, well, whatever, never mind, and pinned Welsh's Choose Life monologue to their student bedroom walls might balk at defining eudaimonia for their kids. Who are they, after all, to say what the good life looks like? But this reluctance to impose values, Wiseman gently suggests, can result less in an enabling freedom than in a moral vacuum. And indeed it is, right? If you refuse to even point your children in the general direction of meaning and flourishing, you have set them that much further back on the real task of life, the implicit kind of consumerism, or the implicit what do you call that? The implicit materialism in that statement is not freedom enabling. You're actually cursing them uh, to spend that much more time. Now, like, fortunately for me, I had parents who sort of provided this kind of direction and this kind of arena, this kind of sandbox in which I could kind of play around, and I rejected that and rebelled against it. But at least I knew that there was something that I had to wrestle with, that other people had wrestled with these things. But, to raise your kid as a kind of functional nihilist is a kind of strange version of year zeroism, to pretend as if, well, and it also just pretends that you are an isolated individual. To cut your children off from their patrimony is the worst of sins in my book. And that, I think, is what happened to us at scale. Exceptions, to the contrary. Without a model to reproduce or rebel against, growing up with acceptance parents can feel tractionless, like a wheel spinning in a void. Is it really so strange then that a generation raised in this void might in some cases turn to religious faith in search of clearer guidance? When the world's faith traditions offer cumulative millennia of writing and practice on how to live well, it stands to reason that some young people would opt not to reinvent the wheel, but rather to fill the void. And this speaks so profoundly to my 18, 19-year-old self when I encountered these great works and really studied them, really wrestled with them, really read them. And I had to put aside all of my kind of progressive ideology that I was better because I lived in 1992, and those idiots who lived in 1892, they just didn't get it. But I get it but then I realized that I had been given nothing except a kind of posture, that the nihilism that I was listening to in the music, this sort of post 70s music, the nihilism in both explicit and implicit in it, was a crying out for something, for some kind of meaning. And for me, I found that, of course, in great books. That at least it was a series of breadcrumbs that I could kind of follow backward out of the maze of the Minotaur, right? I could, sort of the golden thread that I could kind of go back and trace my way out of this trap. And for so many in my generation, we were just put into the trap, even said to go, sort of burrow deeper into the trap, and no way to get out of that trap. And sometimes I get really mad about this. Again, not at my parents. My parents were solid, but certainly with the cultural manufacturers, that they had constructed this myth, um, of self-expression, this myth of, the urban monoculture myth, as some people like to talk about, that that I could leave behind all the old stuff and forge forever forward, and it wasn't true. And this in turn sheds lights on why such an exploration might take literally any form other than the mainstream Anglican Church. In Anglican Church, in its conventional form, Anglicanism functions as a continuation of acceptance parenting by religious means. And this is so true, because of sort of the wedding of public schooling and the National Health Services and the BBC and the Anglican Church. Part of what they're rejecting is all of that, because all of it has taken on the role of destroying the culture out of which it comes. There's a strange self-loathing at the core of this, and that is the de facto truth that you pass on to the next generation. Nihilism itself is not neutral, right? And those things can get, I think, confused. One of the great myths, the great myth of our time is this idea of a kind of default setting neutral position, that we exist kind of in a vacuum, and we can kind of shunt away all the other stuff, and we can just sort of see what emerges. Right? But that is in itself an information, an informing structure, and it is a myth, right? Just as much as modernism is a myth. Modernism is a filter that pretends to be the frame of the whole story, as somebody like C.S. Lewis would say. But the fact that these young people are seeing through the default nihilism of all of these structures and going to something super strange and foreign, like a charismatic church or a high liturgical church, shows you that they are, more than material realities. and that they have a longing for something that far exceeds the kind of nanny state curated garden model of contemporary nihilism. There are, of course, great many deeply devout Anglicans, but in virtue of its historical role, the Church of England walks precarious institutional tightrope between politics and faith, political and spiritual England. And this invites a public image less as a spiritual body than as a representative of whatever remains of British institutional Christianity that hasn't been subsumed by the welfare state and mainstream secular liberalism. And this is her close, and I think this is really good. Actually, is it? Oh, a little more. Yeah, okay. And then she goes on to chart, the sort of what has the Anglican Church done with its patrimony? Well, it holds, silent discos in the naves of their cathedrals, their beautiful cathedrals, and it stages navel gazing at scale. Confronted by what looks overwhelmingly like a mass abdication of moral authority by parents and religious institutions, then perhaps the last form of youthful revolt available is against nothing itself, is against nothingness itself, a rejection of relativism and an embrace of doctrine and mystery. In other words, people want mystery and they want doctrine. They want the sense that something means more than what I can than meets the eye, but also that there are real ways, doctrinal, there are real sort of forms to which to channel this desire. I mean, it is ultimately, as we know, the faith is a desire, right? We could perhaps draw a few inferences from this. Firstly, taken at the broadest level, this presages an increasing faith-inflected world as this generation matures, not just within the Christian church, but also across the fast-growing spiritual but not religious cohort. And of course, my contention is that there's no such thing as a non-religious person. Everybody's religious, right? It just depends. Are you sort of religious in the kind of the legacy way, or are you religious in another way? And I think the real dark elements for me about this spiritual but not religious is that there are liturgies that all of us, you, me, everybody, there are liturgies that we live out on a daily basis. And my sense is that we are living a kind of liturgy of hyper individualism as we sort of gaze deeper and deeper into our black mirrors. Our phones become the mechanism of worship. Our phones become the mechanism of that thing which captures our attention. The idea of, and our attention makes things sacred, makes things holy or unholy, as it were. But this doesn't mean that Christianity is dying out in Britain. If anything, what's on the wane now is nihilism, physicalism, and the reductive nothing butness characteristic of the nevermind era. By contrast, Christianity appears to be growing stranger, more countercultural, and more resistant to corralling in the mainstream political institutions. This is a faith whose God rose from the dead. A generation of relativists will not finish it off. And I see this both in terms of what she's talking about here from an English standpoint or an American standpoint, but I also see this functioning, these same spirits, these same patterns function, for instance, in my own church. We're at the precipice of is this the end of an old era or the solidification of the mid-century? It remains to be seen, but so many people older than me, those people who run my church, still adhere to this kind of flattened bourgeois, non-metaphysical expression of what is at core a hyper strange and a hyper weird and super fantastical truth. If your Christianity isn't weird, then it's just a philosophy. And my patrimony is filled with, angels and demons. My patrimony is filled with the weird and the strange, and all attempts to police that, all attempts to neuter that, or to put it in guardrails, or to put it in a kind of comfortable box that is seen as acceptable, by a bourgeois mainstream, to me is just dead in the water. So to reach young people, all my life I've been told by the progressives in my church that we need to sort of make the church more amenable to our young people. Well, I wonder what they make of these numbers now. Are you ready to make your church strange again? Are you ready to make your church mystical again? Are you ready to double down on ancient liturgy and ancient languages with smells and bells and candles? Like, are you going to do that to reach the young people? Probably not. My guess is that you're going to double down on your flattened modernism. And, it reminds me of Planck's notion about scientific progress. Scientific progress happens one funeral at a time. And I guess it would appear that progress, and I don't mean progress, to sort of some sort of modernist future, but a reorientation to the good and the strange and the metaphysical and the ultimate will occur in our churches one funeral at a time. At any rate, you should check out Mary's piece. It's fantastic. It's in the notes. Please hit the like and subscribe button. I'm also putting together a master class on Frankenstein, specifically in the context of AGI and LLMs and all of this stuff coming out of Silicon Valley. So that will be coming out soon. Until you can catch me on X, and have a great day. Cheers.